Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully refreshed, rejuvenated and ready for another fascinating, interesting discussion. So for this panel, we're going to look at education and mental health in challenging times, a subject which has been touched on already in the previous sessions. This time we have two of our panel here. Excellent. So we are just demonstrating that technology really can work most of the time. But to lead this panel, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Nidhi Singhal from the Faculty of Education here. Nidhi, over to you to lead the panel in the room and or out of the room through this conversation.
I'll try my best. Thank you, Julian. I'm extremely honored to be chairing this session, this particular panel with very four esteemed speakers. The focus of this panel is very much on looking at the impact of the pandemic on the ones who have been most vulnerable and marginalized. So what we're going to be hearing from our presenters will be evidence on issues around mental health across different contexts, how it's impacted children in different contexts, not just in the global south, but many of the debates that we were hearing in the morning about learning loss, impact on socio-emotional development are indeed a reality for many communities in the global north too. So we're going to have evidence presented across contexts. We're also going to slightly change the gear in the format here. So we're going to hear first 3 presentations, and then we've got a fantastic discussant who's going to bring them together, and then I'll open the floor for question and answers. So please keep those questions, hold on to them. We're going to need loads of them in the end. So I'm going to start by introducing our first presenter, and that's going to be Professor Osha Goswami. It's a pleasure to have you here. Osha was the Yidan laureate last year and is the director of the Center for Neuroscience and Education at the University of Cambridge. So over to you, Osha.
So hopefully my slides will appear in a second because we practiced it, the coffee break.
Why aren't they appearing? There we are. And if you want the pointer.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you. So as Nidhi said, my expertise is children with learning difficulties. So my research is with children with dyslexia and children with developmental language disorders. And it's very important to note that children with learning difficulties have been particularly affected by the pandemic. So although we heard a lot this morning about the impact of the pandemic for pragmatic reasons across the globe, just simple factors like your school closing, for example, it's also been more difficult to access education for children who have learning difficulties because they have intrinsic differences in the way their brains process information that requires specialized teaching. And so that means whether you're a child in a rich economy or a poor economy, if you have a specific learning difficulty, then extra support was needed during the pandemic for you to be able to access your education. So I'll focus on the major learning difficulties of childhood, of which there are classically recognized to be 4. But we can see the numbers affected because about 10% of children in any community have specific learning difficulties. These are inherited ways in which your brain works differently from the brains of other children, which means that accessing information is more difficult for you to learn. So the classic learning difficulties are dyslexia, developmental language disorder, so 2 linguistically based difficulties, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, when it's very hard to focus your attention, and then dyscalculia, which is a more relatively recently recognized disability, or learning difficulty, I should say, where you have specific difficulties with number cognition. And we have some idea of the underlying brain basis of each of these difficulties, which I won't talk about today, but what's very important from the aspect of teaching and learning is that each learning difficulty requires a very specific type of teaching that needs specialist delivery. So even if your parents are very engaged and want to help you, they may not have the skills to help you if you have one of these learning difficulties and you're trying to access learning at home. In fact, as you'll see from the rest of the talk, it's very difficult to access education online if you have any of these difficulties. So if we start with developmental dyslexia, we've already heard the importance of reading for assessing education and how well we're delivering education across the world. But because reading is difficult for children with dyslexia, then it follows that any materials that are delivered for home teaching or for online learning that require print are going to make learning more difficult for these children because they aren't very good at reading. So class-level appropriate materials will always be difficult for these children because they can't read at the same level as their classmates. There's also a linguistic processing problem underlying developmental dyslexia, which is to do with sound structures of language, and that also then affects their verbal memories. So it's harder if you're a child with dyslexia to follow a sequence of verbal instructions. So if you're trying to access learning through a talking head of your teacher on the screen telling you what to do, again, then you're disadvantaged as a child with dyslexia, even if you're in a rich economy and you've got your computer to access the online learning. And we experienced that ourselves in my research centre, where our dyslexia project, where we found that over half the children with dyslexia, because they were from communities, so they weren't a special sample from special schools where their parents had paid for them to have extra support, but they were from homes where there wasn't computers. So even the kind of tasks that we were trying to do with them to help their learning, they couldn't access just because their families in this rich economy of the United Kingdom didn't have computers. And this affected all the children, not just the children with dyslexia. So we saw evidence in our project of reading going backwards, not just for the children with dyslexia, where of course the cost is really great, but also for the typically developing children. Reading was going backwards during the pandemic. We can make a similar case for developmental language disorder. So this is, in a way, a more debilitating condition in the sense that it's very hard to get meaning from spoken language. You really need all those extra cues that we have when we're in the context of real live engagement, things like the cues through the eyes of a live person to help you understand what I'm saying is very different from seeing my face on a screen. And so that means that for children who have developmental language disorders, it's very hard to access learning when it's delivered remotely through an oral language medium. And of course, that was the only medium really available. These children can't access education to the same efficiency if they're being taught with the complex language that might be appropriate for their age level, because they need simpler language in order to understand what they're supposed to be learning and in order to benefit. And we saw this again in our ongoing research. So another of my projects is with children with developmental language disorder. In fact, that is the project that has been kindly funded by the Yidan Foundation. And although we'd made some nice tasks to try and assess the underlying problems with language that I think are causing this learning difficulty, the children who were not the control children, the children who had developmental language disorder, found these very difficult to do online, whereas we knew that when we were sitting next to them in the classroom, they could do these tasks. So again, it just shows that even if you're in a rich economy, if you have a specific learning difficulty, the pandemic has really affected your learning. I won't say so much about dyscalculia because there is actually less research on what the brain basis is of this disorder, but it is known that these children have very specific problems acquiring understandings of magnitude and number, and things like the number line, the ordered magnitude in which we use numbers to represent quantities in the world. And one feature that seems very specific to these children is impaired working memory. So working memory is your kind of mental workspace where you're keeping all the information that you're supposed to use for learning going at the same time so you can get on with your task. And that's impaired in these children, which means that, again, if learning is being delivered online through some kind of remote facility, these children are really going to struggle. And dyscalculia is actually as prevalent as developmental dyslexia across the world. It's just more poorly understood, and so it's less frequently diagnosed. And then, of course, children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it almost goes without saying that these children are going to be disadvantaged by the pandemic, doubly by not being in the classroom because of their difficulties in sustaining attention. So you need very skilled teachers to help children who have ADHD to learn. And they have to basically teach to the individual child's strengths and ability to focus attention. And there's no way you can deliver that if you've got some kind of online facility with a one-size-fits-all approach that might be appropriate for the rest of the class of children, but not particularly for those children with ADHD. So we can see that for all the major learning difficulties of childhood, whether you're in a rich or a poor economy, the pandemic has had a very specific effect, a detrimental effect on your learning. I just also wanted to take the opportunity, as I've got the floor, to mention early years, because that is my other speciality, is early child development. And really, education in the early years, the children have to be together. Being together in a virtual environment is not the same. You need to be with other children who help your learning, and they also help you acquire all these other skills that we might want to call executive function skills that are so important for thriving as an individual learner. You know, the ability to reflect on what you know, to think about what you're good and poor at in terms of acquiring information. All of those skills develop out of these early pro-social skills, this learning that you do peer-to-peer, that helps you control your own behaviour, know what you're good at, become a more independent learner with confidence. That comes from being with lots of other children in the early years. And so again, children across the globe, whether they're in rich or poor economies, have been affected by the pandemic, closing their schools. I just also wanted to mention children with sensory difficulties, because we don't talk about these children very often, but as we know, these are real problems. If you're deaf and you can't access the curriculum, or you're blind and you have to access the curriculum through Braille, what happened to you when your school closed? What happened to you when your teaching assistant wasn't there anymore because of COVID shutting everything down? This is a real problem for these communities. And when the children go back home, so say you were in a deaf school with specialised teachers, your family may not have sign language skills, or they may not be able to help you access the online learning that's being delivered by your special school, because you, as a parent or carer, don't have those skills yourself. So these are children who are already disadvantaged. And I think in the global pandemic, especially in more economically disadvantaged countries, these children have really been hit very hard. There's just, even their families who might be very engaged are not necessarily able to have the skills to help them, or the materials that they need. So I thought I'd put up this slide from a project we did in the UK government a long time ago called the Foresight Project, but we were really looking at developmental trajectories of learning. And we were trying to find the evidence from education that could enhance children's mental capital and well-being, so affect the future of their countries and their personal well-being as well. And as I was leading on learning difficulties, we developed this slide to really show that a child with learning difficulties is going to have a trajectory that's affected and that is different from that of a child who doesn't have these brain-based inherited difficulties that they can't do anything about, that impede their access to the curriculum. And we were trying to make the case for how important it is to have a supportive learning environment. And I think it links back to what Charles Chen told us at the beginning. It's really about nurture. It doesn't just mean the environment in your school and your classroom, but it means the environment in the community and the home as well. And when that is supportive, then if you're a person with learning difficulties, you may still be able to achieve, in terms of your own developmental capacity for development, above that of a child who hasn't got any learning difficulties, but who is facing many unsupportive learning environments. And I think the very simple message of COVID is that this is a very unsupportive learning environment for all our children, but the impact on children who have learning difficulties is going to be huge because of these difficulties I've covered in accessing what has been put in place by governments. So really, if we're thinking about vulnerable children, the vulnerable children who have learning difficulties are in our midst, whatever the wealth of our economies. And this is probably around 10% of children, according to the data that I collected for the Foresight report, in every country in the world. These learning difficulties are inherited. The children can't overcome them by more effort. We need to put the right kind of teaching in place to support these children so that they can really thrive and get the most out of their education. So the methods of teaching that have been developed for children with learning difficulties are absolutely crucial going forwards for their trajectories throughout their lifespan, and of course then for their own countries and the economies of their countries as well. So I think it's very positive that recent science is helping to clarify what these mechanisms are in the brain that are causing these learning difficulties, because it really means we can enhance the ways in which we teach these children. But it also means that given COVID, more attention needs to be paid to this group of children in terms of levelling up for them what they have lost through losing their access to education. And I would say the same thing about small children. We really need to not forget the early years and how much those children will have been impacted by just not being together with other children through COVID. And we also know that will affect mental health, which Paul will talk about shortly. So again, I think as a community, we need to think about what are our priorities in our education systems.
I'm sorry, I'm going to encourage you to wrap up.
Okay. And as I've mentioned, I think early years and learning difficulties are particularly crucial. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really powerful. I think you really brought to light with evidence the discussions we were having about disabilities earlier in the morning. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to move on to our Zoom connection there and very warmly welcome Dr. Eram Mariam. So Eram's joining us from Bangladesh and is the Executive Director of the BRAC Institute of Educational Development, and will be again focusing on issues around ECE and teacher well-being themes we picked up in the morning. So Eram, over to you, and I will give you 2 minutes to go, Mark. So please do, I'll apologize in advance for that. But over to you. Eram, you're on mute. You might want to unmute yourself. I love saying that even after a year. Perfect.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Nidhi, and thank you to Cambridge University and the Yidan Prize Foundation. It's really an honor to be here. So, you might ask, of course, about the COVID. We heard from Osha, and COVID was a very defining moment for us all. And through COVID, actually, we understood the importance of staff well-being as well as the quality, the quality of our services. Were the services really relevant and right? So what were we doing before? Osha said the importance of ECD, and ECD is one of the things that we are doing. And so before COVID, all the ECD that we did in Bangladesh was around play. We focused a lot on learning through play. But, we also focused on the mental health for the Rohingya setting, in the humanitarian setting of Cox's Bazar. And in the humanitarian setting, we focused on learning through play as well as healing through play. We also looked at the psychosocial support in the Rohingya setting. But everywhere else, we were looking at play and, a little bit of socio-emotional development, but not the kind of support that we provided in the Rohingya setting. Then COVID happened. And, we all came together and we thought that, well, what do we do now? And our experience with the Rohingya setting in the humanitarian setting indicated that psychosocial support services needs to be integrated. And, this psychosocial support services needs to be integrated for all the setting. And so we came together and we developed a model of a 20-minute phone call from a frontliner like you see here, and to a child and a caregiver. And this 20-minute phone call would happen every week. And so, we did it for about 16 months in the Rohingya setting, and we are still doing it, in many of the settings that, we have in Bangladesh. And so with the call, you would have someone like this at the other end and a caregiver with the phone. And what the frontliner would do in this 20 minutes would speak about, about the caregiver, how the caregiver has been, what has been happening. Is there anything that you want to share? And with the child also about, how the child has been. And, of course, the play with the child, trying to do the physical play, the rhymes and stories. So this was something where it was in presence of the caregiver, so that after the frontliner is not there, the caregiver can continue. And through this process, this pasheati, we call this model pasheati, which means beside you. And we were really connected. And through this process, caregivers and children, they felt valued and respected. But we also realized that frontliners require the skill and the capacity to be having this connectedness and teleconversation week after week. So, it would be frontliners like this. And, we realized and we recognized that, the frontliners also required support. And, when the frontliners felt valued and support, we also saw the implications of that in the kind of support that they were providing to the children and caregivers. So you might ask that, what about the measurement? What about the monitoring? And so first, before COVID struck, all the child outcomes we did with Child, which was a tool developed in Cambridge by Dr. David Whitebread. And we also used ASQ socio-emotional. But also during COVID, we realized that in addition to the ASQ-SE, we have to look into the mental health status of the caregivers. So we applied the GHQ-12. We also looked at new tools, looking into core engagement skills of the frontliners. And, we also had to assess the mental health status of the frontliners. So we applied PHQ-9, and we started developing more tools in collaboration with NYU, looking into the quality of those teleconversations happening every week and looking at frontliner fidelity tools. So you might ask, how do we redefine education? So, for us, then, this COVID, what it taught us was mental health and psychosocial support needs to be integrated with play and ECD. We cannot have ECD without play and mental health and psychosocial support. Second is systems of care is very important for the children and caregivers, but also the frontliners. We cannot provide care unless we get care. So systems of care have to be developed in the programs that we do. The third is that, the integration of mental health and psychosocial support, all of this needs to be looked into, measured, and data, evidences, so that we can take it forward. And then finally, of course, compassion and connectedness and support needs to be a priority. Just around this time, because of COVID, we brought the BRAC Mental Health Strategy 2020-2030. And in this mental health strategy, we made 3 core assumptions. The first is that we are all in this together. Mental distress happens to everybody. The second is our expression of mental distress is different. Our experience of the world is different. And the third is that, whatever we did, if we looked at respectful, compassionate approaches for our staff, as well as, of course, for the quality of the service that we provided to the beneficiaries, to the population that we work with, respectful approaches for our people, both of these will have really good outcomes and will have the best outcomes. So finally, what have we learned? We learned from COVID that children's emotional well-being matters. We learned from COVID that frontliners' emotional well-being matters, and that approaches need to be culturally relevant. In Bangladesh now we have a situation where, the schools have reopened, but we have huge dropout. And so these approaches that we do here will be different from anywhere else. And we cannot have other approaches in other settings come and, impose them here. These have to be very much organic and very much bottom up. And we have to ensure quality when we do compassion and mental health. We have a pool of 50 psychologists working with us. And as I said earlier, these have to be measured for impact. So the long story short, connectedness, compassion, and mental health has to be a core focus of education. And what we did in ECD, the kind of movement, the kind of integration that we did in ECD, now we are looking into having mental health and compassion a core focus in primary education. So I'll just end with a little personal note here that when I came to Cambridge in 2004, the theme that I was working on was emotional well-being in education. And it was people like Professor Robin Alexander, Dr. David Whitebread, Edith Esch, Mary Jane Drummond, who motivated me to look into this further on. And I have not stopped. Thank you so much to the Faculty of Education. Thank you.
Thank you, Eram, for a very passionate presentation. I really liked your idea about the systems of care and not only about the child, but also the carer. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Professor Paul Ramchandani. And I always love Paul's title, which is the Professor of Play. Well, it goes Professor of Play, Education and Development at the University of Cambridge. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honour to be here today, and particularly given the topic, focusing on equity and the future of education, and also acknowledging the work of CAMFED. Every time I hear about the work that they do and see the work that they do, I'm inspired, and again today, the three of you talking about it today has been wonderful, so thank you very much. So, as Nidhi says, I'm the Lego Professor of Play here in Cambridge. I'm also a child and adolescent psychiatrist working in the NHS, and it's more with that hat on than the play hat that I'm going to talk today. I direct the Pedal Research Centre. I'm just going to say a very short thing about that so you know. It's a research centre that was established a few years back by a donation from the Lego Foundation, and they continue to generously fund a lot of the work that we do. And we do research to understand play, but also to consider how that can improve the education and life of children. And play is central to the lives of children. If you stop and ask them, that's what they'll tell you. They'll talk about the things that they do, the relationships they have, the learning they do, but they'll usually, especially in younger children, talk about it through the lens of play. So I'm here today to talk about mental health rather than play specifically, but as we've heard with other areas of child development, the two are very linked in many ways, and that is a fact about childhood. Different aspects of children's life and development are interlinked. A lot of what I'm going to say about mental health will overlap with some of what Osha said earlier on about children with particular developmental and learning difficulties. Sometimes that's because they're the same children, but not all of them are, but there are significant overlaps. When talking about mental health and education, I've basically got 4 very simple points to make. Mental health and learning are closely linked, and I hope to show you a little bit about that. Mental health problems are common and they are a global challenge. They're different in different places, but mental health problems are a global problem. The pandemic has impacted children's mental health. There's a range of evidence from many, many different countries that are showing that. And it is one of the reasons for widening inequalities. There are others as well, but it's one of the key reasons for widening inequalities. And finally, and perhaps most importantly to me, mental health problems can be prevented and they can be treated if we have the will to do it. And that's a very important part of that statement. So how are mental health problems and educational or academic attainment linked? In several different ways. So a mental health problem in a child can lead to them struggling as they learn and lead to difficulties in academic attainment. If you think of a young person with depression, for example, unable to concentrate, unable to attend to learning, maybe missing school because of that, their education is going to be affected. Can also work the other way around. So children who are struggling with academic attainment, struggling within school for whatever reason, can have a big knock-on effect on their self-esteem, feelings of self-worth, effect on their relationships within, peer relationships within school, and so increase their risk of things like anxiety and depression. And also, of course, there can be factors that affect both. So things like poverty, things like family violence, a whole range of other factors that usually outside school that can increase the risk for children of having mental health problems and also for difficulties in academic attainment. So it's a complex set of relationships. But when we look at the research, and to start with, I'm going to draw mostly on research done in the UK by colleagues in UCL and in Manchester, we do see that there are complex patterns. Firstly, mental health and education are clearly linked. The risks are clearly linked. That's not to say that all children with mental health difficulties are not going to do well academically, because many of them do, but their risks are going to be increased of having difficulties. Secondly, there are shared risks. I mentioned poverty, family disruption, and other factors that lead to an increased risk of both. But over and above that, there are also some very clear patterns. So particularly thinking, we'll start with behavioural problems. Children with behavioural difficulties are at increased risk of academic failure or struggling to reach their potential, even when we take those other factors into account. The gender findings are a bit mixed in the studies. Boys tend to have a higher rate of behavioural problems, and those problems are often established early, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. In girls who are experiencing anxiety and depression are at increased risk of having difficulties with their education, but there's a clear bidirectional risk. So, as I say, girls who are struggling within school also have knock-on effects potentially on their mental health. Coming on to the second point I wanted to make, mental health problems are common and a global challenge. Just a couple of bits of data here. So firstly, the UK has been tracking mental health difficulties in children in big surveys since 1999. There have been 3 up until 2017 and 1 more recent follow-up during COVID. And the pattern has rather depressingly been an increase. It's only gone up, you may say, from 9.7% to 11.2%. That's not a very big increase in percentage terms, but when you think about every single child between the ages of 5 and 18 in the country, that's a large number of children, that's a large change. And that has been across 3 surveys, just ticking up and ticking up and ticking up. The figures are broadly similar. There's a lot of inter-country variability, but if you average across different regions and average across the globe, you get a broadly similar pattern. So 14% in sub-Saharan Africa. This was from a survey of all the studies that have been done to that point in 2012. And the more recent global estimate is 13%. So that's what, 1 in 7, 1 in 8 children affected by a mental health problem. And this is using often interviews, so not just children who experience anxiety. We all experience anxiety. That's a normal part of life. But children who are experiencing difficulties like anxiety, depression, behavioural problems, significant enough to impact on their functioning. So it's a very important difference from the normal ups and downs that we all experience. The third point I wanted to make is about mental health and widening inequalities. So in the UK, there's been a survey conducted more recently in 2020, trying to use a similar methodology as was possible with those previous surveys. And what we're seeing was during lockdown, there's a tick up again in the rates of mental health problems. A lot of that's about anxiety and anxiety difficulties, but other things too. So up to 16%. Not everybody does worse. Within that, there are children who are struggling more. And those tend to be the children with either pre-existing difficulties or pre-existing risk factors, children from more challenging backgrounds, either family backgrounds or personal difficulties, those experiencing violence at home. The depressing thing about that for me is that that was predictable from before the pandemic. We kind of went into it knowing that these things don't affect everybody equally. So it does mask real problems, that average, for a group of children at risk who are experiencing much worse problems. And that shift is seen across countries. I've put some references in. I'm very happy to share them. If you want to email me afterwards, I can share the kind of background literature to that with you. The final point I want to make, and this often gets, I think, overlooked, because talking about mental health is challenging, is in many ways a depressing picture, because you're talking about people experiencing mental distress, and that's troubling for all of us and difficult to think about for all of us. But I think it's really, really important to remember that these problems can be treated and they can be prevented. Not in all cases, but in many, many cases. Like across medicine, we talk about diseases we can prevent. We don't usually mean we can prevent everything, but we can prevent a significant proportion with vaccination and other measures. Same in mental health. There are things that we can do that can prevent a large amount of the distress that young people experience, and also intervene early to prevent that becoming a chronic and difficult problem going forwards. The solutions don't lie necessarily within mental health services. The solutions to treatment often lie there, but the solutions to prevention and early intervention lie in other services and in other aspects of society, communities, families, and with government and non-governmental organisations. So it's complex. We've heard about complexities in education earlier on today. There are things that we can do, and there are solutions to these things. I want to just, as my last point, I think, just pick up on something that Osha mentioned earlier. If we get in early, we can potentially make the biggest difference. That's not to diminish what we do in adolescence. That's very, very important. But if we get in early with children who are at risk, we can make a difference that will then affect their trajectory, not only of their mental health problem, but if we get in, for example, children with behavioural difficulties in the first few years of life, we can make their transition into preschool and into school much better. If they can help with their behavioural problems, we can potentially make school a more positive experience right from the start. And we know those early days of school make a foundational start for where children will go later. So getting in early and making start, just echoing some of what Osha said, I think is fundamentally important. And we've shown in the team that I work with here in Cambridge that you can relatively simply make important differences. So we've found with a brief intervention that you can change the behavioural difficulties, you can modify behavioural difficulties in very young children, as young as 1. So these things are possible with the right kinds of investment and the right kinds of enterprise across sectors. And I want to mention the Wellcome Trust. I very inarticulately tried to express this last night to Julia, but I'll have another go now and see if I can do it any better. The Wellcome Trust is one of their kind of highlight issues made mental health a focus of their research, and they're investing a large amount of money, but also a large amount of kind of intellectual capital into that. And they're focusing within that a lot on prevention and intervention early in children's lives. That makes a huge material difference to the field because they are a big organisation, they can invest a lot of money. But it also makes another difference, which for me is almost as important, because working on the front line in mental health services, when you see organisations like the Wellcome Trust prepared to put their money and their time and their thought into something which is often overlooked and considered a Cinderella speciality, it makes a huge difference to what you feel like you can do day to day. It imbues you with a sense of optimism, which is sometimes very, very difficult to maintain. So I'm very grateful to your colleagues and you for that. I'm going to leave you there. That was with my key points back again. I'm not going to repeat them because you've listened to me for long enough, but thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much. I think you really brought the data out to show how important it is for urgent action. But I'm not going to dwell too much because I'm going to now turn to inviting our other Zoom panelists who's actually a discussant to really bring these three very rich presentations together and provide her perspective. So over to Amy Jo Dowd, who's joining us from Denmark and is the head of evidence at the Lego Foundation. So Amy, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you see? Oh, there I am. Awesome. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here and have the opportunity to reflect on this important topic and these very rich presentations. Of course, thinking about education and mental health invokes play for a member of the Lego Foundation staff because play is a default for us, perhaps, but also because it has such a dual role in both addressing learning and mental health, to help reduce anxiety, to help us take control of situations, feel confident in doing so, strengthening our social relationships and giving deeper understanding of different dynamics and situations, reducing complexity and helping us both pay attention and even find new opportunities. Now, these big, broad statements, of course, need an evidence base. And though I'm not a presenter, if you contact me, I'm happy to present. I'm happy to share a paper where we've been looking at this because we are exploring it in a variety of contexts. And what I find is so important and interesting about this panel today is that really the whole planet has been in challenging times. And I think as Eram was sharing with us, the things that were happening in one place that was supposedly special became relevant everywhere. And what I feel that the panelists are sharing across is that, in fact, it maybe always was that way, and we weren't seeing it as clearly as we had the opportunity to do when the pandemic hit us. Plato, a very long time ago, obviously, wrote that our need will be the real creator, which is translated over time to the perhaps more familiar phrase that necessity is the mother of invention. And I think what these presentations point to for me very much is the necessity and the urgency for exploring and inventing and testing new ways to meet our needs, and that the pandemic has sort of redefined those needs as being this nexus between mental health and education. So I want to share three main themes that I hear across the presentations and then pose a question to start our discussion. And those themes are, first, that the feeling that the timing is ripe to reassess priorities about and how the systems that we have can better meet needs, better apply the evidence that we have, because really we now know they can work differently because they had to. And then I said the second one is that any approach to reassessing those priorities has to have this holism, this broader drive that has connection, that has compassion, as well as knowledge and skill development at its core. And as we're doing that, thank you, Eram, we want to combine these areas with measurement. And Paul also saying, look, there's evidence out there that we can build on as we're doing, taking up this great task. And I think finally, the reflection that at least some of this work can be done remotely, to explore what are the opportunities, what are the inventions, what are the innovations that actually brought new ideas to those old systems. And that really leads me to my question for every one of the panelists to start off is, really, I would love to learn your ideas and your reflections on what innovations and inventions have you seen that you feel come out of the real urgency to explore mental health and education side by side during the pandemic that you feel are sort of your priorities and your hopes to be taken up into hybrid models as we go forward? What are the sort of pieces and the nuggets that you feel might be what you call a silver lining in this experience that you want to sort of see taken up to benefit all the different types of children that we need to be serving? I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Amy Jo. That was very powerful and also a nice way to get us started on a discussion. So can I start with Osha? Would you like to start by answering Amy Jo's question?
Well, I think the nuggets is quite difficult because so many children in our project. I think the question of nuggets is quite difficult because so many children in our projects had such a horrible time in the pandemic. But I do think what Paul said earlier about the total symbiosity of mental health and your emotional well-being for your learning is so important. And that's something we knew before the pandemic. Because if you're a child who has a learning difficulty, if you can have early support so that you reach primary school at a similar level to your peers in terms of, say, your language skills, then you're not going to experience all the emotional negativity of not learning as fast as everybody else, of people, possibly treating you as though you're stupid even though you're trying incredibly hard, because that early support has been put in place. And for me, that early support has to involve interactions with real people. I think that's the real fundamental problem that the pandemic has shown us, that, okay, we've got great technology, but young children's brains are the same across the world. And it's not technology that's important for their brains. It's interacting with other people. So one positive nugget could be from my baby project. So we have a project called Baby Rhythm, where we're following 112 babies from basically 2 months of age, trying to look at how well their brain processes rhythmic aspects of language, which is very fundamentally important for how well you learn language and also literacy. And the pandemic came when we'd finished all the brain imaging, but we were halfway through the language follow-up measures with toddlers. And so the only way we could carry on gathering our data was to involve their parents. And so we made versions of our language measurement tasks online using puppets and so on Zoom that parents could watch, and then they could do those same puppet games with their 2-year-olds. And actually, we actually didn't lose any families from the project. It was amazing because the families were so motivated to help their children's language development. So that does suggest that if you've got the access and you've got the technology in your home, then there can be very simple ways of boosting child development, boosting early learning environments in families or daycare settings that involve technology, but where what you're really doing is supporting the interaction between the people who are delivering the learning and the people who are benefiting from the learning. Because especially in the early years, there's no substitute for a real person. Technology is not going to solve all the problems in the way you'd sometimes believe.
Absolutely, that's very well said, Osha. Eram, can I invite you in to respond to Amy Jo's question about nuggets?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you. And before I start, I would like to actually thank also CAMFED. And Lucy was the one who sort of contacted me first. So thank you so much, CAMFED, for also organizing this conference. So I think I think one of the things is that, through the pandemic, it's been a time where, because sort of, we were working so much on play, but we realized that, mental health was so important for the child and how the caregiver's mental health also impacts the child. And, what Osha just said, that, having this environment in the family, that environment in the family is so important. And so for us that, we use a kind of very low technology of connecting with the caregivers, the moms. But, that I think that what we found was the caregivers found it so empowering. And, they, with the skills, of course, developing the skills of the frontliners who were having these conversations, but it was something like the caregivers felt so important And so the caregivers, kept on saying that, okay, so, will you sure be able to call me next week? Are you sure calling me next week? And so in the next week came, and, she would say that, well, I want to say this, and, I want to talk about this a little more. And so, and that was something that the caregivers felt, and there was a kind of, not only feeling valued and respected, but also saying that, at this time when I have no one to talk to, I can talk to you. So I think this engagement with the caregiver, and the other thing I said about the systems of care, that sometimes, we work, of course, with children and the families, but we also forget that there are our frontline workers. There are, the facilitators and others in the tiers who support. And so everybody is there. And, even with the frontline workers, we did the, assessment, and we found 8 to 12% were mild to moderate depression symptoms. So I think these systems of care, it's something that, we take it now, has to be done, everywhere. So in that ecosystem of management, there has to be this system of care.
Thank you, Eram. Paul?
Pick up with a couple of points. One which overlaps with Osha. We didn't pre-plan this, but it feels a bit like I'm following in her wake. We were working before the pandemic on an intervention using picture books with families to promote interaction. So it's about the parent and the child sharing a book, cuddling up together, talking about the book, the parent following their child's lead, learning about their child's lead. It's all about the relationship. It does have added benefits in terms of children's language development as well, but it's fundamentally about how can we promote a very positive early relationship. And we were forced to try and take that online. It's an intervention that normally parents come together in a group, and we tried to think about how can we best replicate that. And so we have an online program. We have telephone calls or video calls to parents to support them in how they learn that. And we've got to a model that potentially then, even after the pandemic, can be used to reach a far wider audience than was possible before. The technology is a challenge, and that will limit where we can do it, but we can downgrade some of the technology to think about using mobile phones, etc. So that's one thing. It's a silver lining to a very difficult, awful time, but it's one thing that might have some benefit for the future that we probably wouldn't have got to as quickly. And the second is just within the NHS. I got sent to Peterborough to work in an autism clinic during the pandemic because the NHS was frantically filling gaps, and that was one that I could fill and support with. And I was able to see people via video link, and that's something that we've been talking about for years as a possibility. It was on Star Trek when I was a child. But it happened. It happened within the space of a few weeks with some glitches. So we now are able, going forward, to offer parents still video consultations and children video consultations at the moment. They don't work for everybody. They have their limitations, but they offer some real advantages for some families. Practical, but also other advantages. And going forward, we'll be able to offer parents and children and families the choice, which I think is a huge shift, which wouldn't have otherwise happened.
Innovation under stress. And I think the other thing I picked up is how interesting to hear you all talk about parents, because I think one of the fundamental ways in which, when we rethink education for the future, will be what is the role of parents and caregivers in that education system, given that in some countries for nearly a year, parents are the forefront of delivering education. So really powerful reflections here. I'm going to invite questions from the floor now, if anyone would like to get us started here. Anna. So there's one down there. So Anna, could you please just briefly introduce yourself and who the question is for in the panel,
Sure,
if anyone's
thank you very much. Yes, I'm Anna Vinyals. I'm director of the Leverhulme Trust and former professor of education at University of Cambridge. Fascinating presentations, thank you very much. So I was struck by the difference, perhaps in your perspective, Osha, of the individual child with learning difficulties and coping during COVID, moving to Paul's eloquent sort of articulation, just the scale of the problem, both in global north and global south in terms of mental health. And as Eram said about the on-the-ground experience of just how bad this can be for just how many children. So how do we get solutions that are at scale if we have to do it child by child? You've talked about the video technology, maybe that can help, but I feel it's perhaps a bigger problem about how do we actually get mental health in a universal way, as opposed to kind of fixing it after the problem has developed.
So thank you, because that's a really important point.
And we addressed that in the Foresight project. So this is a really unfortunate piece of work in a way, because we did this wonderful science-led looking at how to optimize mental capital and well-being for societies across the world. And then there was a change of government, and it basically just got put on a shelf and left behind. But in terms of child development, I think what you need to do is identify key drivers, so the kind of factors we've heard about, the importance of play, the importance of having supportive learning environments, so that not just your teachers in the school, but your parents and so on know how to help optimize your development, and then try and give that to everybody. So you're just shifting the whole normal curve along the baseline, as it were. So you're not just trying to pick up the children with learning difficulties, because actually everybody will flourish from certain very simple things. Children are really the same the world over, and the things that benefit them are not rocket science. They're really simple things, like having someone to play with, having someone care about how you progress. You know, even the foundation, Charles's foundation, is partly based on the fact that his illiterate grandmother would hear him read every day when he got home from school. She didn't know whether he was getting it right or wrong. But it just comes back to Paul's point that this is an emotional thing as well as an intellectual thing, that having people in your community who care about your learning is really important. And the kind of things they need to do aren't hard. They're things like taking the time, being interested, and having child-led learning, which is another thing Paul mentioned. So often, you want to help, so you kind of come in and you try and get the child to do the things you think they should be doing to progress. But actually, you're much better off just taking a step back, looking at what the child is interested in at that moment, and then building on that. So early years teaching is actually the most difficult kind of teaching, because you can't just stand at the front of the classroom delivering your curriculum, but you can have learning goals in your mind that you then introduce through play by seeing what the child is interested in and following from that. And these things aren't rocket science, but they could transform the way that children are brought up in every society. And one of Eram's important insights from their foundation is how important play is. You know, they're working with families in Bangladesh who think, oh, I can't waste time having my child playing. We need to get out there doing some economic activity or something. But actually, for that child, playing, having time to play at the age of 3 and 4 is going to be massively more beneficial overall in the lifespan of that family than having to immediately be in the market, I don't know, selling something. So these are not rocket science things. Child psychology has known about them for a long time, but they somehow get sidelined in these big discussions, and yet they're fundamental to education.
Well, I think you've expressed most of what I would want to say much more eloquently than I can, so I'm not going to cover the same ground. I'm going to just add one thought, which is a question more than an answer to your point, Anna. Because one of the things that has struck me, not just struck me, it struck most people, I think, is that the last year or more has been a time of terrible intergenerational inequality. Children have been taken away from school and have been kind of held at home for good reasons, but that's been to protect people like me and older than me. It's not particularly to protect them. So there's been a big price paid by children for the benefit of older generations. And I think if we can, we need to think about what that means for our society generally. And I'm going to get a bit grandiose here, but there's something behind all the questions that we have about education and about what we do that's about the importance of children and the importance of valuing the next generation, and as a society and a collection of societies, what we choose to value. And it feels to me that's missing from certainly in the UK, our political discourse about what are we trying to build the future for? Well, we're trying to build it for the next generation. We've got to take that longer term view. There's no easy solution in that, but there are some solutions and answers in that. But that feels to me like a fundamental underpinning question that we should grapple with, because it has profound implications for what we can do as a society.
Thank you, Paul. There was another question, for the gentleman here in the second row.
Yeah, thanks everyone. My name is Tom Dana. I'm the Chief Exec of Street Child. Firstly, congratulations to CAMFED, an organisation that we're constantly inspired by. Context and a question, context quickly. Street Child focuses on foundational learning for children in ultra-low resource and disaster-affected situations. We're constantly trying to think, how can we educate a child or make a difference to child's learning for $10, $20, $50? And so thinking about that challenge, we look for solutions which are easy to scale and are cheap. What are the what are the low-hanging fruits, the easy wins that on a very low budget, replicable in without extensive detailed training that you can see in some of your fields for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For that, I'm going to bring in Eram, I think, who has a lot of experience working in this context. So, Eram, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. I think that what I think he said, that it's very important that, obviously in the disaster areas, but also everywhere else, like we have found that, and what are the low-hanging fruit there when we look at actually something that Osha said, that is actually very fundamental, that these should have been actually in education all the time. And we don't know why it wasn't. We don't know why it was continuously getting sidelines. But, this thing about how the child feels, and how that feeling is so connected to how the child learns. This is so fundamental, and the relationship that the child has around her. And so I think that, I think it requires a completely kind of, looking into how things we have been doing before. Why so much investment in other areas and why not in this? So I think it really requires us to ask that question. And, from now on, I think that, when I was sort of started doing education 25 years ago, we would look so much into kind of curriculum materials, teacher training, and, staff training, etc. But then, now when I look back, I said, where was all this about, how the child felt? And the teachers training around again how the child felt and how to really develop that meaningful relationship with the child. So I think that we have to go back to the drawing board about what Paul was saying about what we value and what is really important here. And so those should really tell us where the investments should be.
Thanks, Erin. Osha?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and it reminded me of something Julia said earlier about people having to cede ground, give way in some power dynamic if change is going to occur. Because some of the messages that child development tells you that are important for early education are actually not sort of skill-based, that teachers have to deliver curriculum X, but it's that they have to know how to do child-centered, play-guided learning. And sometimes that feels like a professional thing to give up. If you've been trained as a teacher, I remember Angie saying that in one of our debates, the Yidan debates of the luminaries, that you've also got to think about the context of the society you're trying to affect. If you're coming in to say to teachers, actually, you're doing it all wrong, this is actually much better, then the teacher has to cede ground and say, yes, actually, let me learn what's better. And that may be something that's actually quite difficult in certain types of society to deliver. So it's such a global issue. We have to be sensitive to so many factors, but the power dynamics have to change.
And I think that's a theme that was picked up earlier also. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to take one quick question from the gentleman here in the front.
I really was going back to, building on the previous question, but perhaps going back to both Osha and Paul, because I suppose it is that question, isn't it, of what evidence is there for effectively being able to scale up interventions that demand a much more personalised approach. You talked about taking the signal from the child. Of course, in mental health, we know with CBT and so on, it's the same. It can be highly effective, but it's very personal, typically one-on-one. So are there some interesting models to scale up those sorts of approaches?
Thank you. So very quickly, Paul.
Okay, very quickly. So I touched on one earlier on, thinking about the book sharing and interaction. So some fairly simple messages about fundamental parent-child relationships, helping parents to know the capabilities of their young children, even very young babies, and the amazing things they can do, helping them to see the importance of their simple interactions, play and otherwise with them, and taking time to slow down and notice their children's cues and what children are doing and saying. They're fairly simple messages. They can be delivered very simply as a piece of information. They can also be delivered in more elaborate methods through video feedback, and that's probably more effective, but we need to scale using the technology and using the level of a kind of investment and time that we have. But we can do that across the board in a variety of different ways.
Okay, I'm going to stop here, if you don't mind. I can see Julian's. We're the only thing between lunch. I'm just going to, first of all, say a very big thank you. I mean, I've not been able to take on all the questions, and I do apologize, but it just is evidence of the very rich presentations you did. And thank you so much, Amy Jo, for your comments in the end. Thank you, Eram. Thank you, Osha. And thank you, Paul. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Yes, thank you to all of you, the three in person, to the two of you there, Eram, Amy Jo, lovely to see you both again. And, I look forward to the next time we get to meet in person. We do now have just under an hour for lunch. As ever, if you're not actually here in the room, you'll have to sort yourselves out. Those of you who are here, lunch is sort of out and that way on the ground floor, upstairs on the first floor as well. And if you ask for a special meal, that will be upstairs. And I look forward to seeing you in just under an hour. If you have the opportunity to enjoy the grounds of the college, do have a look. It is a beautiful, beautiful space, and fresh air is always a good thing to have. See you in just under an hour.